On the morning of January 17, 1781, Lieutenant Colonel Banastre Tarleton led 1,100 of Britain's best soldiers, dragoons, Highlanders, and Royal Fusiliers across a stretch of open South Carolina pasture land to finish off a retreating rebel army. He had marched his men through the night to catch them before they could escape across a river at their back. Tarleton expected this to be over by breakfast. What Tarleton rode into instead was a line of men he'd already beaten once before. Men everyone, including their own commanders, expected to break and run at the first volley. He wasn't wrong about that. He just didn't know their running was the plan. So how did a scratch American force, built around troops with a documented, humiliating habit of collapsing under fire, manage to trap and annihilate Britain's most feared cavalry commander in less time than it takes to watch a single episode of television? To understand what happened at a nowhere patch of cow pasture in the South Carolina backcountry in January 1781, you first have to understand exactly how badly the war had been going for the Americans in the South. Because by that winter, badly doesn't quite cover it. 8 months earlier, Charleston had fallen. It was the single worst capitulation of the entire war. Over 5,000 Continental soldiers surrendered in one stroke. An entire Southern army handed over almost intact. Then, that August, at a place called Camden, what remained of American resistance in the region collapsed even further. General Horatio Gates had assembled an army that, on paper, looked respectable. In practice, when British regulars advanced with bayonets fixed, the militia holding the front of that line, untrained men in civilian hunting shirts, many of them armed with whatever they'd carried from their own farms, simply broke. They didn't fire a shot in most accounts. They didn't slow the British advance for a single minute. Gates himself reportedly rode dozens of miles from the field before he stopped to find out what was left of his own army. By the winter of 1781, the American military presence in the South barely existed as an organized force anymore. British General Lord Cornwallis held Georgia, most of South Carolina, and genuinely believed total victory in the region was a matter of weeks, not months, away. Standing between him and that outcome was a small, half-starved, poorly supplied detachment under a Virginia backwoodsman named Daniel Morgan, a few hundred Continentals, and a loose collection of militia companies camped in hostile territory with winter closing in and supplies running out. Cornwallis didn't see Morgan's force as a threat. He saw it as unfinished business. And to finish it, he sent the one officer in his army who had never once failed to run down a retreating enemy and destroy it. Banastre Tarleton, 26 years old, commanding the British Legion, the most feared strike force in the entire Southern theater. Tarleton had never lost an independent engagement, not once. Cornwallis gave him a simple job: catch Morgan before he can cross the river at his back and erase him. That's the position everyone was in on the morning of January 17th. An American commander with a broken, untested, mostly untrained force backed against unfordable water, being hunted by a British officer who had built his entire reputation on the specific skill of running down exactly this kind of army and finishing it before it could recover. On paper, there was no version of this story where the Americans walked away. Here's the thing about the actual weapon at the center of this story, the forgotten one, the one nobody puts in the thumbnail. It wasn't a rifle. It wasn't a cannon. It was something every professional officer on either side of that war would have told you flatly was worthless. It was the militia itself. By January 1781, American militia carried one of the worst reputations of the entire Revolutionary War. At Camden, 5 months earlier, they'd folded in the opening seconds of contact. Before that, they'd broken at Long Island, at Brandywine, at half a dozen engagements where trained Continental regulars held their ground and militia simply didn't. British officers by this point in the war didn't fear encountering militia in a battle line they counted on it, because running was, by documented reputation, exactly what militia always did when regular infantry came at them with bayonets. Even American commanders had largely given up trying to force them to stand. You put militia in a line, you accepted they'd probably break, and you built your plan around damage control, not around trusting them. Daniel Morgan understood this better than almost any officer in the Continental Army, because, unlike most professional soldiers of his era, he understood exactly what kind of men actually made up that militia line, because he'd spent much of his adult life being one of them. He wasn't a career officer by trade. He started his working life as a teamster, hauling freight through the Virginia backcountry. Tough, blunt-spoken, and by his own later account, once flogged nearly to the edge of death by a British officer during the French and Indian War for talking back. That grievance, according to accounts that circulated in his own lifetime, stayed with him for decades. He went on to lead a company of frontier riflemen on the brutal, starving march to Quebec in 1775, and commanded the sharpshooters at Saratoga in 1777, whose fire helped bring down a British general at extraordinary range. Morgan didn't look at militia the way a European-trained staff officer would have looked at them, as failed regulars. He looked at them as untrained men who'd repeatedly been asked to do a professional soldier's job, and had repeatedly, predictably, failed to do it, because nobody had ever asked them to do anything smaller. Every commander who'd tried to use militia as a wall before Morgan had gotten a rout for their trouble. Morgan looked at the wreckage of Camden that August and asked an entirely different question. Not, how do I stop these men from running? But, what happens if I let them run? On purpose. On my schedule. Exactly where I want them to go. That question is the actual weapon in this story. Not a rifle, not a formation. A complete inversion of what everyone on both sides assumed a militia line was for. Daniel Morgan understood something that every officer who'd lost a battle with militia in the line had refused to accept. You cannot make untrained civilians hold a fixed position through discipline, threats, or sheer force of will, because that is precisely what every failed commander before him had tried, Gates included, and precisely what had failed, without exception, every single time. What you can do instead is give them a job small enough to actually finish. Morgan's plan didn't ask his militia to win the battle, or even to hold the line for any meaningful stretch of time. It asked them to do exactly one thing: fire 2 aimed volleys at an advancing enemy from realistic rifle range, something frontier riflemen were genuinely, individually capable of doing well, and then walk away, not scatter into the trees in panic, not run blind, walk in some order at a deliberate angle around the flank of a low rise toward a spot where they would reform as a unit. He took the one behavior everyone already knew militia would produce under pressure, retreat, and instead of treating it as the plan's failure point, he built it into the plan's opening act. Now here's where this stops being a clever idea and becomes an actual machine. Because Morgan didn't just have an insight, he built a structure out of it, piece by piece, and every single piece had a narrow, specific job to do. He started with the ground itself, and he chose it with real deliberation. Open, gently rolling pasture land known locally simply as the Cowpens, a stretch of common land where backcountry farmers grazed and fattened cattle before driving them to market. The trees across it were mature and widely spaced, with almost no undergrowth between them, meaning there was no cover available for an ambush, but also no cover for the kind of confused, tangled melee that had helped doom other American lines before. Behind Morgan's position, a few miles to the rear, ran the Broad River, high and unfordable at that time of year. He put that river deliberately at his own army's back. Not because he was cornered, because he wanted every man in his army to understand, without being told twice, that there was no disorderly retreat available on this battlefield, while making absolutely sure that the specific retreat his militia would perform during the battle itself ran sideways around a hill, not backward into deep water. Then he built 3 separate lines, stacked in depth, each with one narrow function. The first line, roughly 150 of his best marksmen and skirmishers, pushed well out in front of the main position, with instructions to specifically target officers, the men on horseback, the ones shouting commands and directing the advance, before falling back in good order to the second line. This wasn't harassment for its own sake. It was designed deliberately to strip the leadership out of the British advance before the 2 main bodies of infantry ever made contact with each other. The second line, the militia proper, under Andrew Pickens, a South Carolina commander known personally for a kind of austere, almost puritanical discipline that stood in sharp contrast to the flamboyant cavalry officer riding toward them. These men had exactly one job: hold their ground as the British came into effective range, fire 2 aimed volleys, then withdraw. Not in panic, but at a specific angle around the American left flank toward the third line waiting behind them. Not a route, a rehearsed, choreographed exit with a destination already assigned. The third line. Continental regulars from Maryland and Delaware under Colonel John Eager Howard, trained, disciplined troops actually capable of standing and trading close-range volleys the way militia couldn't. This line existed to receive the British assault only after it had already been finned by the skirmishers and dragged out of formation, chasing what would look, from their side, like a second collapsing militia line. And behind all 3 of those lines, held completely out of sight and out of the fight until the precise moment Morgan needed them, William Washington's cavalry. Barely 100 dragoons, a genuine fraction of what Tarleton commanded, kept in reserve specifically so they could strike a flank that, by the time they moved, would have no support left to defend it. Morgan reportedly spent the night before the battle walking personally among the campfires, talking to individual militiamen by name, making absolutely certain that every single man in that second line understood, in plain terms, what 2 shots and then fall back actually meant before a single shot was fired the next morning. The exact wording Morgan used that night hasn't survived in a form that can be traced back to a single confirmed document, but the substance of it is consistent enough across the accounts written in the years afterward that the shape of the story, if not the precise sentence, is worth trusting. Every single element of this plan depended on one specific gamble: that the enemy commander would look at an orderly, controlled withdrawal and read it as exactly the kind of collapse he'd already seen from American militia before, on more than one occasion. Morgan wasn't just fighting Tarleton's 1,100 soldiers that morning. He was fighting Tarleton's confidence in his own considerable experience, turning the enemy commander's greatest strength, the instinct to press an advantage the instant he saw one, into the very thing that would destroy him. And that confidence was not remotely unearned. That's precisely what makes this dangerous, and precisely what makes the trap work. Banastre Tarleton was, as of that January morning, undefeated in independent command. 26 years old, born into a wealthy Liverpool merchant family, he'd abandoned a law career for a cavalry commission and turned the British Legion, a mixed force of loyalist cavalry and mounted infantry that he had personally trained and shaped, into the single most feared strike force operating anywhere in the Southern Theater. American soldiers and civilians alike called him Bloody Ban. 8 months earlier, at a crossing point called the Waxhaws, his legion had cut down a surrendering Continental force so thoroughly that the phrase Tarleton's quarter entered common American usage, meaning effectively, no quarter given at all. Whether that engagement was a deliberate massacre or chaos and confusion in a violent, disorganized melee is still genuinely debated by historians today. But at the time, on the American side, almost nobody was debating it. They believed it completely, and it terrified them. which mattered just as much as whatever actually happened. Tarleton's entire career, every promotion, and every reputation-building victory had been built on one specific instinct. The moment the enemy starts to waver, hit them immediately and hit them hard, before they have any chance to recover their footing. That single instinct had never once failed him in independent command. So when Tarleton marched his men through the freezing night to catch Morgan before he could cross the broad river, exhausted, half-fed, with almost no rest and no real opportunity to scout the ground ahead of him properly, he wasn't behaving recklessly by his own standards. He was doing precisely what had made him undefeated up to that point. He was following the instinct that had never once been wrong. He was about to discover that the man waiting for him on the other side of that low rise had studied Tarleton's last easy victory far more carefully than Tarleton had ever bothered to study his own pattern of winning. The skirmish line opened first. Rifle fire cracked out at range, well ahead of the main lines, and several British officers went down in the opening minutes of contact, exactly as Morgan had designed it. The advance lost immediate direction and leadership before the two main infantry bodies had even properly closed on each other. Then the militia line, exactly as instructed, fired its first volley into the advancing British ranks. Then a second. And then, on cue, began withdrawing around the American left, moving at that same deliberate angle Morgan had rehearsed with them the night before. Tarleton read it exactly the way 5 months of documented experience had trained him to read it. Another militia line breaking under pressure, just like Camden. He pushed his men forward faster, harder, chasing what genuinely looked to him like a disintegrating enemy, and in doing so, dragged his own formation into a ragged, disordered pursuit. Officers and soldiers outrunning their own cohesion in the rush to close the kill before it could escape. They ran, at speed and out of formation, directly into Howard's waiting Continentals, still in good order, still disciplined, delivering a volley into the disorganized British ranks at devastatingly close range. And it was at exactly this moment that something happened which was not part of Morgan's plan at all. An order meant to reposition a single company on the American right was misheard somewhere in the noise and smoke as an order to retreat. The entire Continental line began an unplanned, unauthorized rearward wheel, the exact kind of unraveling that had doomed American formations in battle after battle before this one. For a handful of seconds, it must have looked, from the British side, like the entire American army was finally coming apart at once, exactly as expected, exactly as it had at Camden. Howard saw what was actually happening on the ground in front of him. The British, believing they were watching a second collapsing line, were surging forward into close range, without realizing they were walking directly into a formation that was about to stop, turn, and fire at point-blank distance. Howard gave the order to halt and fire directly into the advancing British ranks, turning a genuine accident in the space of a few seconds into the single most devastating moment of the entire battle. The volley tore into troops who moments earlier believed they were seconds away from finishing off a beaten enemy. At almost exactly the same instant, William Washington's cavalry, still fresh, still completely hidden until now, struck the British right flank and rear. The militia, having reformed after their scripted withdrawal exactly as rehearsed, hit the opposite flank. British soldiers who, 60 seconds earlier, genuinely believed they were chasing down a broken and fleeing enemy, suddenly found themselves surrounded on 3 sides simultaneously, with no reserve line behind them and nowhere left to run. The 71st Highlanders and the 7th Royal Fusiliers, caught directly in the middle of that envelopment, began surrendering in mass numbers within minutes of the flanks closing. Tarleton personally tried to rally his reserve cavalry for a countercharge that might have salvaged the situation, and most of his own dragoons simply refused to follow him, breaking instead for the rear of the field. In the battle's final chaotic moments, Tarleton clashed personally at close quarters with William Washington near the collapsing edge of the British line. A brief, violent exchange in which Tarleton reportedly lost 2 fingers, an injury later mocked in British satirical prints for years. According to a story recorded not long after the war ended, Washington himself was nearly cut down from behind during that same exchange, saved only by a young orderly who fired a pistol at the attacking dragoon, a detail popular histories have repeated for over 2 centuries, though its precise particulars have never been pinned to a single confirmed original source. Tarleton escaped the field, but with only a fraction of the men he had led onto it that morning. Here are the numbers, and historians genuinely still double-check them because they read like a typo. Of roughly 1,100 British troops engaged that morning, somewhere between 800 and 900 were killed, wounded, or captured before it ended. The 71st Highlanders and the 7th Royal Fusiliers, 2 established veteran units, were effectively destroyed as functioning fighting formations in that single engagement. American losses, by comparison? Around 12 killed, roughly 60 wounded. And the entire engagement, from the first skirmish shots to the final mass British surrender, took under an hour, commonly cited as somewhere close to 50 minutes, depending on which historian's timeline you follow. In less time than it takes to watch a single television drama, one of Britain's most feared and experienced fighting forces on the continent had been effectively erased from the war. This wasn't a footnote in a longer campaign. Cornwallis had just lost roughly a third of his effective mobile field force in a single morning, and it forced him to abandon his own timeline for winning the South entirely. In the months that followed, he pursued Morgan's superior officer, Nathaniel Greene, deeper into North Carolina, fought a costly and inconclusive battle at Guilford Courthouse, and ultimately marched his exhausted, depleted army toward the Virginia coast, toward a small tobacco port called Yorktown, where a French fleet happened to be waiting. Cowpens didn't cause Yorktown on its own, but it is one of the first dominoes in a chain of decisions that ended there. And without this 50-minute morning in a cow pasture, that chain might never have started at all. There's an older, much larger example of exactly the same underlying principle, if you want a sense of the scale this idea can operate at. In 216 BC, at Cannae in southern Italy, Hannibal deliberately let his center give ground against a much larger Roman army, only to envelop them completely once overconfidence had pulled them too far forward, in what remains one of the deadliest single days in the history of ancient warfare. Different continent, different century, entirely different scale of casualties, but the same core mechanism. Let your enemy's confidence do the work of pulling them exactly where your flanks are waiting to close around them. The lesson underneath all of this isn't really about muskets or cavalry, or even about militia specifically. It's that the thing your opponent believes they already know about you, the thing they've beaten you with before, the pattern they've stopped questioning, is precisely the thing they'll never see coming a second time. Tarleton didn't lose at Cowpens because he misjudged Daniel Morgan's army on that particular morning. He lost because he correctly judged, based entirely on real experience, exactly what American militia had always done before, and never once considered that someone might build a trap out of his own accurate memory. Today, the ground where all of this happened is preserved as Cowpens National Battlefield in Cherokee County, South Carolina. A quiet, largely undeveloped stretch of open pasture and scattered, widely spaced trees where visitors can walk the same low-rise Morgan's lines once stood on in terrain that hasn't changed nearly as much as most Revolutionary War sites have. No cannon fire now, no shouting, no smoke, no hoofbeats. Just wind moving through trees that are, by most accounts, not so different from the ones standing there in January 1781. The morning Britain's most feared cavalry commander rode confidently into a retreat that wasn't won at all and never saw it coming until it had already closed around him.